Es ist soweit. Walfisch in Sicht. 100.000 Packungen Margarine schwimmen hier. Getroffen.
Germany had become the biggest importer of whale oil within just a few years. It started in around 35 and Germany already had the third largest whaling fleet.
One of the main problems, of course, for Germany was the so-called Fettlücke, or Eiweißlücke, in which not enough fats and oils were being produced in Germany. It cost money to import the whale oil, but also it was a question of having Germany self-sufficient.
We can see that even in the 1930s, several stocks had already declined significantly. It's probably safe to assume that even today, the number of whales in the Antarctic still hasn't returned to what it was at the beginning of the 20th century.
Das große Walfangmutterschiff Walter Rau mit 22.000 Tonnen Tragfähigkeit, den größten unserer modernen Ozeandampfer vergleichbar, erkämpft sich durch schwere See den Weg in die Antarktis.
German whaling in the Antarctic begins in 1936. 3 years before the start of the war, the primary concern for the National Socialists is fat. After all, it's in short supply in Germany. Whale oil has to be imported from the Norwegians and the British at a high price. These giants of the sea are ruthlessly slaughtered under the swastika flag.
When the catch begins, there's no time to sleep. No time to eat. No, nothing at all. But the whole boat lives just to hunt whales, shoot whales. It was necessary to produce margarine. People had to be fed, so you just had to accept this cruelty.
Industrial whaling in the Antarctic began in the 1920s. In Northern Europe, the large whales were already almost extinct. Norway and Great Britain, the leading whaling nations, needed new hunting grounds. With the stern haul, the Norwegians had developed a new technique to haul the whale straight onto giant factory ships, where they could process them immediately. Tens of thousands of blue, fin and sperm whales lost their lives. Their blubber was processed into whale oil and sold internationally. Margarine could be produced from whale oil. The historian Ole Sparrenberg researched whaling in the 20th century and says nothing has been more harmful to whales than the invention of margarine.
It was cheap cooking fat for the working class, so to speak. So of course a huge market opened up for whale oil, as it could be used for that. After the First World War at the latest, whale oil had become an important raw material for margarine, amongst other things. And in the 20s, Germany was already one of the largest markets for margarine, and therefore also for whale oil.
The Walter Rau margarine factory in the Teutoburg forest. By the end of the 20s, Walter Rau is one of the biggest German manufacturers. There is a growing discontent with depending on supplies from abroad against the background of the global economic crisis that has hit Germany hard. Whale oil is also important for the soap industry. The detergent manufacturer Henkel and Walter Rau consider going into the whaling business with their own fleets in the 1930s.
The state didn't actually push it forwards. Initially, it was even quite cautious and put the brakes on. They also didn't want to strain their relationship with Norway, with whom they still got whale oil at a very good price.
In 1935, cooking fat is so scarce in Germany that it is rationed. Agriculture cannot produce enough fat. Soap manufacturer Henkel is the first to take action. He has the 15-year-old cargo ship Württemberg converted into a whaling ship and calls it Jan Wellem. Helmut Kersten has researched German whaling for the last 30 years. He knows the history of every single ship. Jan Wellem is a compromise.
Henkel was the first with the Jan Wellem because he decided on a conversion, which was quicker. He also ran into difficulties because the conversion wasn't really suitable for whale processing, and it didn't have the same tonnage that new constructions do.
The Jan Wellem is good to go as early as 1936. The ship is 143 meters long with a crew of 250 men. The floating slaughterhouse can stay on the ocean for months on end. Walter Rau also decided to enter the whaling business at the same time as Henkel. But the margarine producer chooses a different route. He has a completely new mothership built in Bremerhaven using state-of-the-art factory facilities. Almost the entire whale can be processed on the ship. Walter Rau is a staunch member of the NSDAP.
From all that you can see and tell, I would say that Walter Rau was 120% in. He was also a big supporter of this self-sufficiency policy and was convinced of the benefit of becoming independent of foreign countries and of operating our own whaling fleet.
The Walter Rau is almost 170 meters long. The factory ship is accompanied by the most well-equipped fishing boats that can go hunting alone with explosive harpoons in any weather conditions. One of these fishing boats is now in the museum harbour of the Shipping Museum in Bremerhaven. The ship was only built in 1939. As war broke out, the Rau 9 could no longer be used for German whaling. 83-year-old Hans-Joachim Trappe has been familiar with whaling ships since his childhood. As a small boy, he visited his father, who worked on the Walter Rau. After the war, Trappe went whaling himself as an operator.
Whaling was the most exciting thing, because first of all, it was my first ship. The technology was completely new. I had to learn a lot.
The fishing boats in the Antarctic hunted blue whales and fin whales, giant animals that still captivate Trappe today.
I went back out on deck at midnight, and then I saw a whale that was lying on the side of its belly, slightly sideways. Its mouth was open. I climbed into it. I took my knife and cut off a piece of whalebone. My wife said later, "What would have happened if its mouth had closed?"
In 1937, Germany has 7 hunting fleets. The Unitas is another state-of-the-art ship from the British-Dutch margarine and soap manufacturer Unilever. Nazi policy forces the company to reinvest all the profits it made in Germany back into Germany. Aside from Rau and Henkel, all the German whaling fleets have business ties with Unilever.
The share of Unilever, this British-Dutch corporation involved in German whaling, is actually considerably larger than it seems at first. After all, 5 out of 7 fleets belong to the Unilever group. However, it didn't necessarily have control over them. The ownership and operational structures are very complicated, and at the end of the day you can't really tell how much influence Unilever has and how much the state has. That was also like a tug-of-war between the two sides.
By 1936, Germany is already gearing up for war. Hermann Göring is commissioned by Hitler to implement the 4-year plan.
The 4-year plan goes back to a memo written by Hitler himself in the summer of 1936, at the end of which he demands that the German military and economy be ready for war within 4 years. And for that to happen, the substitute materials industry would need to be strengthened and the economy made more self-sufficient, which means sourcing more from Germany's own resources. This was then made into a publicity campaign with Göring as the official representative for the 4-year plan. However, this goal of becoming ready for war within 4 years was not conveyed to the public as such. The message was rather, it's about preserving German freedom and German honor and German agricultural self-sufficiency without depending on foreign countries.
Das Wichtige allein ist vor allen Dingen, dass die breite Masse unseres Volkes so weit genügend Lebensmittel bekommt, dass sie in voller Kraft arbeiten und schaffen können. Verbraucht an Nahrungsmittel das in erster Linie, was sie aus eigener nationaler Produktion befriedigen können.
Hermann Göring was very much bringing whaling into this 4-year plan and bringing the ideas of fish as well, fats and oils. At this period, there were even questions about whether people should use wooden spoons in the kitchen or metal spoons, because a wooden spoon would soak up the fat, which could be used in other areas. That was really part of the types of questions, or not, the types of propaganda being sold to people of conserving fats and making a stronger country.
Archive documents from back then are stored at the Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven. Scholars are using them to support their research into German whaling.
And this is a piece of Erste Deutsche Walfanggesellschaft. Right, it says E, D, G and W here.
The Australian historian Charlotte Coling-Smith has researched why whaling ultimately fit the Nazi regime so well.
Both Hitler and Göring were very much interested in bringing all the resources of the sea into Germany and really using the resource of the sea, which they felt was an underused resource.
Henkel's Jan Wellem leaves the port of Hamburg for the first time on the 26th of September 1936 and sets off on the almost 20,000-kilometre journey to the Antarctic. She's accompanied by fishing boats. They are to shoot as many of the 2 largest whale species as possible, blue and fin whales. At first, the atmosphere on board is good. They travel through warmer climes for weeks on end. The crew while away their free time playing games and enjoying the sun.
On the way there, we built ourselves a swimming pool. We watched movies. But of course, the main thing we did was handicrafts, to make things that you needed for the catch.
Dinge herzustellen, die man beim Fang gebrauchte.
Kurt Reder from Kiel went whaling in the 1950s for the Greek shipowner Onassis. He hired around 500 German whalers from the pre-war fleets. Kurt Reder, who was 22 at the time, learned everything from them. After all, the work on a whaling boat hadn't changed.
I think even the harpoon guns were the same ones as before the war.
November 1936. After almost 6 weeks of travel, the Antarctic comes into sight. It's getting colder and more uncomfortable on board. The crews on the fishing boats prepare themselves for the hunt.
Fishing boats are small, nimble ships that actually have a very unique shape. They have a raised bow where the harpoon gun stands, and there is a walkway from the bridge to the harpoon gun.
Alles wird für den Schuss vorbereitet. Der Ausflug bezieht seinen Posten in der Tonne. Da! Ein Wal bläst Steuerbord voraus. Alles an Deck ist in Hochspannung, denn alles hängt jetzt ab von der guten Zusammenarbeit zwischen Beobachter, Steuermann, Maschinist und Harpunier.
Shooting whales was an art that only the Norwegians had mastered. That's why the Scandinavian competition was hired as harpooners on every whaling ship.
They were absolute stars who were treated like professional footballers nowadays, because the outcome really depended on their expertise. So I think there were also German shooters, but as far as I know, no fleet ever set off without Norwegian shooters, although you had to pay them in hard currency, of course.
Bewundert habe ich die Harpuniere dafür.
I admired the harpooners because they knew how the whales would dive before they shot them, where they would rise up to the surface again. The image is still clear to me. There's a fishing boat, there's the harpooner standing by the harpoon.
Steht eine Harpune.
The whale is too far away. He can't shoot. He had to get much closer than 100 meters. So he couldn't shoot. The whale dives away. The boat moves to a certain place and stays there waiting. And a short time later, the whale pops up right next to it and he shoots it.
Volltreffer, ein schwerer Blauwal. Mit aller Kraft sucht er zu entkommen. Aber die Leine, die Harpune und Fangboot verbindet, hält ihn fest. Bis zu 1000 Meter Spielraum hat die Leine, die über einer federnden Rolle abläuft. Durch langsames Einholen der Leine über eine Winde arbeitet sich das Boot wieder an den Wal heran. Ein zweiter Schuss beendet den Kampf.
They were dynamite harpoons that could kill the whales very quickly, and there was no concept, for example, of separating the pregnant female whales or anything like that. And the crazy thing is that today we are still waiting. Despite the designation of protected areas, despite the commitment of many nations to stop whaling and to stop buying whale oil and whale meat, the stocks there have not recovered.
Antje Boetius heads the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research in Bremerhaven. Her grandfather, Eduard Boetius, was also a whaler during the Third Reich. He inspired his granddaughter's love for the sea.
I will never forget how I listened to his stories as a child. It was always the highlight for me when I visited my grandparents in Schöb, near Rendsburg, on the Kiel Canal where they lived, when my grandfather told seafaring stories in the evening. And for me, his stories about whaling were the scariest and most exciting. He had stuck a few photos into an album and he read me the figures of the catch and of the oil processing. But then he told me how he realized that man has hunted the whales into oblivion. He told me that as a sober sailor so well when I was a child, and that left a huge impression on me.
Der tote Wal wird mit Pressluft aufgepumpt und Längsseit festgemacht. Die Schwanzspitzen werden abgeschnitten, da sie beim Aufholen des Tieres auf das Mutterschiff hinderlich wären. Eine Markierung in der Schwanzflosse zeigt die Nummer des Fangbootes.
So that they can continue the hunt unhindered, the pumped-up whale is first left behind. A flag is used as an identification sign. Whaler Hans-Joachim Trapper had first-hand experience of the ruthless treatment of these majestic animals. When he thinks about it today, decades later, he starts to reflect on it.
The thought was there that the animal would be killed, and I don't know how to judge whether that is right or not. But today, of course, I'm also thinking that it wasn't quite right.
After the hunt, the dead animals are collected, moored to the outer wall of the catching boat, and taken to the mothership. Work goes on around the clock on the mothership. The whales are pulled on board using a winch through the opening in the stern and are immediately cut open.
Depending on the size, we were done with a whale in 10 minutes for very small whales and in 20 minutes for normal whales, and with very large blue whales, about an hour.
The knives used by the flensers and lemmers are ultra-sharp. Flensers are the specialists who remove the fat layer from the whale. The lemmers then cut up the blubber to be used for cooking.
The whole deck was used. On the stern, as I said, the abdominal wall, the blubber cover, was ripped off. Then a hawser was put in front of a winch and attached to the blubber side, and then they tore it off the whale. Sometimes it was up to 20 centimeters thick. Then it was laid on deck, and the lemmers came and cut the sides. And there were openings in the deck where the blubber was pulled into and landed straight in the digester.
Das Innere des Schiffes birgt die modernste Fabrikanlage zur Verarbeitung des Wals. Deutschem Erfindergeist ist es gelungen, den Wal zu den verschiedenartigsten Erzeugnissen zu verarbeiten und ihn in hohem Maße der Rohstoffversorgung Deutschlands nutzbar zu machen. Allein die Anlage zur Ölgewinnung erreichte eine Tagesleistung von 508.000 Kilogramm Öl. Diese Menge entspricht der Ladung eines Güterzugs von 40 Waggons.
The most important thing was to boil the blubber and extract the whale oil from it. The Hartmann cooker was used for this, also a German invention. The most modern, most gentle system for processing, with which the best grades of whale oil were obtained, which were also suitable for producing margarine.
Up to 40 whales a day are processed like on an assembly line. After the fat has been separated, the animal is pulled onto the front deck and the carcass is chopped up there. The whole upper deck looks like a battlefield.
It was pretty hard work. It looked desolate. I mean, blubber and blood and fat, slippery. It was so slippery that it was normal for us only to walk on the deck wearing spiked boots.
Fatal accidents were part and parcel of life on the whaling ships, as Antje Boetius' grandfather's diary also tells us.
23rd of December afternoon. Today we caught our 100th whale, which means around 10,000 barrels of oil have been produced. At noon, one of our regular sailors had such a serious accident that he died on the 24th in the morning. This has obviously had a strong impact on our Christmas spirit.
I was shocked that a man with the intestines that weren't being used and were going overboard had been standing with his feet in them and was pulled into the water. That really was kind of shocking. It stayed in your mind for a long time.
Blue whales are over 30 meters long and fin whales up to 27 meters. Besides the fat, the meat is also utilized on the Walter Rau. The original plan was to market it as food in Germany and make a profit.
People also experimented with making canned meat. Some of it was produced on the Walter Rau fleet, but they didn't dare put it on the market. It was used up in certain ways by the military, in hospitals, prisons and so on, even though it was supposedly of high quality. Of course, nowadays we can't verify this anymore, but it highlights the issue of whale meat, which was also seen to be very exotic. We ourselves, the team, were also served whale meat in our meals without knowing it, but it tasted similar to beef. You didn't notice it at all.
Every catch on the whaling ship was documented, evidence of the ruthless exploitation of nature. Since the stocks had declined so noticeably, the whaling nations signed an agreement in London in 1937.
The question, of course, wasn't necessarily the questions that we ask today, where we very much look at the protection of whales. At the time, it was more in the way that we talk about areas that are being deforested. How do we conserve wood? We keep on using wood but keep the forests. This was the question: how do we conserve whale stocks? How do they keep whales, and how to use the whales without the whale stocks disappearing?
It may seem surprising at first that Germany would participate in an international agreement during the Nazi era. A range of minimum lengths were set, with closed seasons established and closed areas defined. How effective it was is another question. In the end, of course, the catch was only superficially regulated. As I said, it was not really about protecting the species, but rather maintaining the industry.
And it continues ruthlessly. In the season following the London Agreement, all the international fleets combined shot almost 55,000 whales, a record result. The sea as an inexhaustible source of raw materials. This is the message of a propaganda exhibition in Hamburg in 1937. Hermann Göring marvels at fish and whales as suppliers of almost everything: leather, wool, baking ingredients, protein, confectionery. The regime sweepingly declares the sea to be a German colony.
The sea as our only colony is a slogan that comes up very often at this time. This way of thinking is expressed when one's own country's resources are reaching their limits, and when foreign trade is no longer possible or no longer desired, and one can supply oneself from the sea, where there are new and initially still very large resources available.
To make even better use of these resources, the regime devises a plan. In 1938, a ship, the Schwabenland, is sent to Antarctica on a secret mission. The aim is to photograph and map Antarctica with a view to claiming ownership of it in future. On board the ship, there are scientists, photographers, pilots and sailors. The name of the undertaking, the German Antarctic Expedition.
They had a ship with a catapult, which had a flying boat they launched, and it photographed parts of Antarctica for the first time. They also dropped arrows with swastika symbols that were supposed to mark a German claim and their German presence. The main reason for this undertaking was actually whaling, because that has really been the only economic use of the region until recently.
Cornelia Lüdecker has studied this expedition and talks about it in the ice landscape of the Bremerhaven Climate House.
They wanted to claim at least one area for themselves. There were already claims from other countries, from Chile, Argentina, I think also from the British at the time, to be sure that they had a base in case something happened to the ships, that food was there, that maybe whale oil or other things could be deposited until supply ships came to pick them up. Ultimately, they wanted to take possession of an area for Germany in order to have land stations such as these in some way.
The Schwabenland stays in Antarctica for a good 2 weeks. 2 flying boats take off on reconnaissance flights over an area twice the size of the present-day Federal Republic of Germany. The photographers take 11,600 aerial photographs. They freely name the area Neuschwabenland after their ship. On the very first flight, the men experience a surprise.
The amazing thing was how they took off for the first time. Everything was white all around and they actually discovered mountains. They hadn't expected that at all, and of course that was the big hit.
Mountain ranges and ice-free lake landscapes that no human being has ever seen before. The expedition members named their landscapes from the air.
Strangely enough, not after names or names related to the National Socialist pantheon, but instead after participants or people connected with the expedition. So we have the Kraul Mountains, named after Otto Kraul, and the Wohltat Massif, named after Helmut Wohltat. And this is actually the most enduring legacy of the German whaling history to this day, that there are still mountains in Antarctica named after these people. People who are no longer known by anyone other than experts. They have somehow gained a piece of immortality where they're internationally recognized names in the Antarctic.
The men mark the territory, but it is not yet an official land seizure. First of all, the aerial photographs are to be evaluated and topographical maps drawn up. But the outbreak of war thwarts the Nazis' claims to ownership.
The publication of all the place names with coordinates and mountain peaks was only done in 1950 or 52, but ownership claims were definitely not made. Why? The Second World War put a stop to it.
This chapter of German whaling under the swastika ends as the fleet returns home in the spring of 1939, shortly before the start of the war. Antje Boetius inherited this small box from her grandfather.
The most special thing he left me just before he died was an odd ritual the whalers had when they came home and made presents for each other. This is an ear bone from a blue whale. If you look at it now, it doesn't look that spectacular, but inside it looks like a kind of shell, and if you look closely, you can see that it looks like a profile. You can imagine the forehead, nose, mouth and beard, and that's what excited me as a child, that grown-up sailors do something as curious as this. Since there were no dolls or anything like that, this was given to the children. These are two faces, a man and a woman, painted. That's what we have left from those whaling days.
The Second World War ends the whaling, not only for the Germans, but also for all the other fleets. For the whalers in the Antarctic, the terrible war comes as a blessing.
You could almost say that the Second World War ultimately saved the whales. On the one hand, it was to blame because there were such supply problems, but on the other hand, the total stop to hunting was essential because the population of the blue, fin and sperm whales, the large whales, had declined so much, and they had been so overfished, going from many thousands to just a few thousand.
The German whaling ships are requisitioned by the Navy during the Second World War. The motherships are used as tankers, freighters or residential ships, and the fishing boats as submarine hunters or escort boats for convoys.
Are you on this picture? Yes, that's me there.
The 96-year-old Rembert Port served on a fishing boat in 1943, accompanying convoys through the North Sea. The agile ships were very well suited for the task. Instead of a harpoon, they now had a cannon on board.
When you met other people from other boats and they said, "So where are you going?" and you said, "I'm on a whaler," they were always jealous because everyone wanted to go on a whaler like that because they were particularly safe. I remember it well. In the worst weather conditions, when you thought all hell had broken loose, you always had trust in the boats.
The fate of the large German whaling ships in the war is very different. The Jan Velem is sunk off the coast of Norway. The Walter Rau goes to the USA as war loot and then goes whaling again for Norway. After the war, Germany lies in ruins. Large cities like Bremen are bombed to pieces. The population suffers from hunger. A sad picture also at the shipyards. The Allies forbid the Germans to build new ships. Only repairs are allowed. The Greek shipowner, Aristotle Onassis, sees his opportunity.
Onassis came up with the clever idea of offering Horvald older ships to overhaul, and in one case also to turn a tanker into a mothership. That kept the shipyard in Kiel very busy, and for that reason he was very, very welcome.
Von Kiel aus ging die in den Howaldswerken umgebaute Olympic Challenger als Walfang-Mutterschiff in See. Mit 12 Fangbooten wird sie sich bei einer Gesamtbesatzung von 504 deutschen und 15 norwegischen Harpunieren in der Antarktis treffen. Eingang nur für Walfische.
He was looking for experts in the field, so he hired all the Germans who had been whalers before the war to work on the Challenger.
Onassis treats his crew well between their hard shifts. Kurt Reder, then 22 years old, who had previously worked on a fishing trawler, still raves about the luxurious everyday life on board after the hard work was done.
On the fishing trawler, we didn't even have hot water. And now, here, there were not only shower rooms, but the shower rooms even had cleaning staff. We didn't have to worry about that at all. The cabins were cleaned, the food was served. I thought I was on a pleasure boat.
The journey was also financially rewarding for the whalers. The men receive a generous share of the profits. The Olympic Challenger brings back 40,000 tons of oil from its 1954 fishing trip.
Out of these 40,000 tons of whale oil, I got my share of 10,000 Deutschmarks. If I convert that to the salary paid in our country, that was about 4 times what a skilled worker on land earned.
In return, they accept the fact that Onassis deliberately disregards international fishing restrictions and animal welfare. But there are also situations that affect the men.
There were also legal requirements not to shoot mothers with calves, to spare them. But that also happened. There was also a calf on board, on deck. It was only, let's say, 5 meters long from a whale that was 40 meters long. That wasn't very nice, because it made you think, why? Such small animals, they have no future. There was an awkward silence when a whale's body was cut open and an embryo came out. Not very often, but they did come out. And in one case, a whale embryo came out that was 5 meters long. It looked like a model of a whale. We stood reverently in front of it and felt a bit ashamed.
The disregard for international conservation agreements is a thorn in the side of other countries. In 1954, the whaling fleet is attacked by the Peruvian Air Force off the coast of Peru in international waters. Kurt Reder describes this experience to his parents in a letter.
A second plane has appeared. They're getting bolder and bolder. This is going too far. It's disgraceful. 2 bombs were just dropped close by. It's just like in the war. I hope they don't drop a bomb that actually hits us.
The ship is forced to stop at the Peruvian port of Paita. The Olympic Challenger is chained up there for weeks. However, neither Onassis nor the crew have come to any harm.
Onassis had taken out insurance for incidents like this, and he got more money from the insurance company than he had to pay us for the loss of the catch.
Onassis ends up paying the crew a handsome additional fee. He sells his whaling fleet 2 years after the incident. Germany finally stops participating in whaling in 1956. In Norway, however, whaling continues, even today. But the fleet is getting smaller and smaller. Dag Meiklebust is preparing his fishing boat for the season. Part of the work is to monitor and calibrate the harpoon. Meiklebust says that modern whaling no longer has anything in common with whaling in the past.
Well, you can almost compare whaling in the past with the Klondike gold rush, without any rules, sense or reason. Looking at it like this, whaling obviously has a bad image historically. Today, that is no longer the case. There is strict monitoring. There's no comparison. it has changed completely.
The ship hunts minke whales off the Norwegian coast throughout the whole summer. They are mostly hunting for the meat of the whales which is sold in Norway. Minke whales are the only species the men are allowed to shoot. They say the stocks are healthy and the quota is reset every year. The catch is monitored by the state.
We have catch quantity controls with daily reporting requirements. And in addition, there is the electronic monitoring unit, which we call the black box, essentially like the system in aeroplanes. Every shot, every use of the hydraulic lifting gear, the weight on deck, everything is recorded and logged by sensors. It's impossible for us to catch a whale without it being recorded.
Norway, Japan and Iceland do not adhere to international fishing bans, but they hunt much less than before and only off their own coasts.
We have the fundamental problem that traditional crafts also exist in whaling. And when we say that it's terrible, I also understand what the whalers mean when they say, well, look at yourselves. You eat chicken, torture cows and pigs. What exactly is different about whales? We only take a little. Is it sustainable? Is it any different to the way people deal with all the other animals that we eat?
Despite killing tens of thousands of whales, the German fleets did not succeed in closing the fat gap under the swastika. Nowadays, margarine is made from plants. A lot of people only realize what the whalers were doing much later.
We didn't think about it, not at all. It never crossed our minds that the resources are limited and that we shouldn't steal too much of them.
The large whaling nations only hunted in the Antarctic for a few decades. Germany is also partly to blame for the fact that the largest animals on Earth were almost wiped out in the process.
Nowadays, we can't really comprehend the sheer extent of the overhunting. In the case of the blue whale, for example, several 100,000 up to 350,000 blue whales were killed and turned into margarine within a few years. And that really means that probably 90% or even more were killed. And we simply have to understand as humans that we have put the Earth and ourselves in situations from which it is no longer possible to recover, no matter how good the intentions are.
Bei noch so guten Zielen dann nicht mehr möglich ist.